The Inheritance Thief's Social Media Meltdown. 25-minute teleprompter script. You're not going to believe what happened when my stepfather thought he could steal my mother's entire inheritance and get away with it. By the time I was finished with him, his reputation was so destroyed that he couldn't show his face at the grocery store without people whispering and pointing. But let me tell you how a man who preached about family values and Christian morals became the most hated person in our entire town. My mother, Sarah, was the kind of woman who worked 3 jobs to put herself through nursing school, saved every penny she could, and built a beautiful life from absolutely nothing. She met my biological father when she was young, and honestly, he was a disaster. He left when I was 5, and it was just me and Mom against the world for the longest time. But you know what? We were happy. We were a team. When I was 16, Mom met Richard at church. Richard seemed like everything my biological father wasn't. He was stable, had a good job at the insurance company, dressed nicely, and most importantly, he treated my mother like she was precious. He would bring her flowers every Friday, help with household repairs, and he even seemed genuinely interested in getting to know me. For the first time in years, I watched my mother's face light up when someone walked into a room. They dated for 2 years before getting married, and honestly, those were some of the happiest years of our lives. Richard moved into our house, the one my mother had worked so hard to pay off, and everything seemed perfect. He helped me with college applications, walked me down the aisle at my wedding, and when my children were born, he was right there acting like the devoted grandfather. But here's the thing about manipulative people. They're incredibly good at playing the long game. They invest years, sometimes decades, building trust and positioning themselves exactly where they need to be for maximum impact. Richard wasn't just being a good stepfather and husband. He was positioning himself for the biggest payday of his life. My mother was diagnosed with breast cancer when she was 58. Richard immediately switched into devoted husband mode. He drove her to every appointment, held her hand during chemotherapy, and made sure everyone at church knew what a dedicated caregiver he was. People would constantly tell me how lucky my mother was to have found such a wonderful man. And honestly, I believed it too. I thought we were watching true love in action. During her illness, Richard started taking over more and more of the household finances. Mom was exhausted from treatments, and it seemed natural that Richard would handle the bills, manage her medications, and deal with insurance companies. He was so helpful, so caring, so completely devoted. When people would praise him for his dedication, he would get this humble look on his face and say something like, "Sarah would do the same for me. That's what marriage means." What we didn't know was that during this time, Richard was slowly and methodically gaining access to every single one of my mother's accounts. He convinced her to add his name to her savings account for emergencies. He suggested updating her will to make things simpler. He helped her organize all her important documents in one place, where he could access them easily. My mother fought cancer for 3 years. 3 long, brutal years where Richard played the role of perfect husband and stepfather. He organized meal trains from the church. He set up a caring bridge page to keep everyone updated on Mom's condition, and he was constantly posting on social media about their journey together. Everyone thought he was a saint. Mom passed away on a Tuesday morning in October. I was holding one hand, Richard was holding the other, and honestly, we were both devastated. I had lost my mother, my best friend, my biggest supporter. Richard had lost his wife of 12 years. We grieved together, planned the funeral together, and I genuinely believed that despite our loss, we were still family. The funeral was beautiful. Richard gave a tearful eulogy about how Mom had changed his life, how blessed he felt to have been her husband, and how he would honor her memory every day for the rest of his life. There wasn't a dry eye in the church. People came up to both of us afterward, telling us how sorry they were for our loss and how proud Mom would be of the way we were supporting each other. 2 weeks after the funeral, Richard asked me to come over to discuss Mom's affairs. I thought we were going to talk about her belongings, maybe figure out what to do with her jewelry or photo albums. I expected it to be emotional but straightforward. Boy, was I wrong. Richard sat me down at the kitchen table, where I'd eaten breakfast every morning before school for years. He had a stack of papers in front of him, and this expression on his face that I'd never seen before. It was cold, calculating, like he was looking at a business transaction instead of his stepdaughter. He slid a piece of paper across the table to me. It was a copy of my mother's will, dated just 6 months before her death. According to this document, Richard inherited everything: the house, her savings accounts, her life insurance policy, her retirement fund, everything. My name appeared exactly once, where I was left her jewelry box and its contents. I stared at this document, reading it over and over again, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My mother had always told me that she wanted to make sure I was taken care of. We had talked about her plans for the house, how she hoped I might want to raise my children there someday. She had specifically mentioned wanting to set up education funds for my kids. When I looked up at Richard, he was watching me with this satisfied expression. He said, "I know this might come as a surprise, but your mother and I discussed this extensively. She felt that as her husband, I would be in the best position to manage her assets responsibly." Something in his tone made my blood run cold. This wasn't grief-stricken Richard trying to navigate a difficult situation. This was someone who had been planning this moment for months, maybe years. I asked him about the conversations Mom and I had about her intentions for the house and her savings. Richard shrugged and said, "Sarah was often confused toward the end because of her medications. She probably didn't remember those conversations clearly." That's when I knew something was very, very wrong. My mother was sharp as a tack right up until the end. The medications had never affected her mental clarity, and she had been making financial decisions independently just weeks before her death. I asked Richard if I could see the original will, the one Mom had made when she first got sick. He told me he couldn't find it, that this was the only version he had. When I suggested we contact Mom's lawyer to clarify things, Richard got defensive. He said the will was perfectly legal, had been properly witnessed, and that questioning it was disrespectful to Mom's memory. As I sat there looking at this man I had considered family for over 15 years, I realized I was looking at a stranger. Everything about his demeanor had changed. The warmth was gone, the kindness was gone, and in its place was someone who clearly saw me as an obstacle to his windfall. I left that day feeling like I'd been punched in the stomach. Not only had I lost my mother, but I was beginning to understand that I'd also lost any financial security she had tried to provide for me and my children. Worse than that, I was starting to suspect that the man I'd trusted, the man who had been part of our family for 15 years, had manipulated my dying mother into changing her will. That night, I started making phone calls. I called Mom's longtime lawyer, the one who had helped her buy her house and had handled her legal affairs for years. What he told me made my blood boil. Mom's original will, the one she had made when she was first diagnosed, left the house to me and split her savings and retirement accounts between Richard and me equally. The lawyer remembered the conversation clearly because Mom had been very specific about wanting to make sure her daughter and grandchildren were provided for. But about 8 months before Mom died, Richard had called the lawyer's office to schedule an appointment for Mom to update her will. He said she was too weak to drive herself and that he would be bringing her in. The lawyer had prepared a new will based on detailed instructions that Richard provided, supposedly from my mother. Here's the thing that made this so insidious. Technically, everything was legal. Mom did sign the new will. It was properly witnessed. Richard hadn't forged anything or broken any laws in the traditional sense. He had simply used his position as her trusted husband to manipulate a sick, tired woman into signing away her daughter's inheritance. The lawyer felt terrible about the situation, but he explained that there wasn't much legal recourse. Proving undue influence would be nearly impossible, especially since Mom had appeared competent when she signed the updated will. Richard had been very careful to make sure everything looked legitimate. Over the next few weeks, I watched Richard's behavior become even more disturbing. He started making expensive purchases almost immediately. A new truck, a vacation to Hawaii, new furniture for the house. He was spending my mother's life savings like it was Monopoly money, all while posting on social media about how much he missed her and how difficult it was to move forward without his beloved wife. The posts made me physically sick. Pictures of his new purchases with captions like, "Sarah always wanted me to enjoy life," and "trying to honor Sarah's memory by living fully." He was using my mother's death to justify his spending spree while simultaneously playing the grieving widower for sympathy. But the moment that really sent me over the edge came about 2 months after Mom's death. Richard posted a picture of himself at an expensive steakhouse with a woman I didn't recognize. The caption read, "Sarah always said she wanted me to be happy." Starting to think about what comes next. 2 months. My mother had been dead for 2 months, and this man was already posting about dating while spending her life savings. The comments on that post were incredible. People from church were praising him for being brave enough to move forward, talking about how Mom would want him to find happiness again. I felt like I was living in an alternate reality. How could people not see what was happening? How could they not understand that this man had systematically stolen everything my mother had worked for and was now flaunting it while pretending to be the grieving widower? That's when I decided that if the legal system couldn't deliver justice, I would have to find another way. Richard wanted to play games with social media? Fine. Let's see how he liked it when the tables were turned. I started by gathering evidence. Every receipt I could find, every social media post, every public record. I documented the timeline of Mom's illness, the changes to her will, and Richard's spending spree. I took screenshots of his social media posts, particularly the ones where he claimed to be honoring Mom's memory while spending her money. Then, I started researching Richard's life. His job, his social circle, his church activities, his online presence. I wanted to understand exactly how his reputation worked and where he was most vulnerable. What I discovered was fascinating. Richard's entire identity was built around being seen as a moral, upstanding Christian man. He was a deacon at church, he volunteered with youth programs, and he was very active in community organizations. His professional reputation at the insurance company was built on trust and integrity. He had spent years cultivating an image of himself as someone you could depend on, someone who did the right thing even when it was difficult. Perfect. He had given me the exact blueprint for how to destroy him. I started small. Anonymous tips to people in his social circle about inconsistencies in his story. Questions about the timeline of events, the speed of his spending, the convenience of a will change that left him everything. I wasn't making accusations initially. I was just asking questions that made people think. Then I created a detailed blog post titled, "How My Stepfather Stole My Mother's Inheritance and Why You Should Know About It." I included everything. Copies of both wills, documentation of his spending, screenshots of his social media posts, and a timeline that showed exactly how he had manipulated my dying mother. But here's the genius part. I didn't just post this randomly on the internet. I researched every single person in Richard's life and sent them the link personally. His coworkers, his church members, his neighbors, his volunteer organizations, even his new girlfriend. The response was immediate and devastating. People started sharing the blog post within hours. Members of his church were forwarding it to each other, discussing it in Bible study groups, and posting it in local community Facebook groups. His coworkers were emailing it around the office. Even people who barely knew Richard were reading about what kind of person he really was. The comments on the blog post started pouring in. People who had known my mother were outraged. They remembered her talking about wanting to provide for her daughter and grandchildren. They remembered Richard's performance as the devoted husband and were disgusted to realize it had all been an act. But the real magic happened when people started sharing their own stories in the comments. It turned out Richard had a pattern of taking advantage of people's generosity and trust. A woman from church talked about how Richard had borrowed money from her elderly mother and never paid it back. A former coworker mentioned questionable insurance claims that Richard had handled. Person after person came forward with stories of Richard's manipulative behavior. Within a week, Richard's carefully constructed reputation was in complete ruins. His church asked him to step down from his position as deacon. His volunteer organizations started distancing themselves from him. His new girlfriend broke up with him after reading about what he had done to my mother. But I wasn't finished. Not even close. I started a social media campaign called Justice for Sarah that went viral in our community. I posted pictures of my mother working multiple jobs to support us, stories about her generosity and kindness, and documentation of how Richard had stolen from her legacy. The hashtag started trending locally, and people began sharing their own memories of my mother, alongside their disgust for Richard's actions. The local newspaper picked up the story. The headline read, "Widower accused of manipulating dying wife's will," and it included interviews with Mom's original lawyer, friends who remembered her intentions, and documentation of Richard's post-death spending spree. Richard tried to fight back, of course. He posted his own statement on social media, claiming that I was a bitter daughter trying to overturn my mother's final wishes. But by then, the court of public opinion had already delivered its verdict. People weren't buying his explanation, especially when they could see the evidence for themselves. His employer started an internal investigation after clients began calling to complain about having policies handled by someone they'd read about in the newspaper. The insurance industry is built on trust, and Richard's reputation for integrity was completely destroyed. The church where Richard had been a deacon for 8 years issued a statement distancing themselves from his actions. The pastor actually called me to apologize for not seeing through Richard's manipulation and to express the congregation's support for my family. But the most satisfying moment came when I received a message from Richard's new girlfriend. She thanked me for exposing the truth about who he really was. Apparently, Richard had been telling her stories about his ungrateful stepdaughter, who was trying to steal his inheritance. When she read the blog post and saw the evidence, she realized she was dating a man who had manipulated a dying woman out of her life savings. The social pressure became so intense that Richard put Mom's house up for sale and moved to a different state. Even then, the internet followed him. His new neighbors found the blog post, his new potential employers found the news articles, and everywhere he went, people knew exactly who he was and what he had done. 6 months after my mother's death, Richard's life had completely imploded. He lost his job, his social standing, his church community, and his girlfriend. The money he had stolen was rapidly disappearing as he struggled to maintain his lifestyle without a steady income. The most beautiful part of this whole story is that justice came not from the legal system, but from the power of truth and community accountability. Richard had spent years building a reputation based on lies and manipulation. When people learned the truth about who he really was, that reputation crumbled like a house of cards. I never got my mother's money back. Legally, there was nothing I could do about that. But what I did get was something far more valuable. I got justice. I got closure. And I got the satisfaction of knowing that Richard would never again be able to manipulate another grieving family the way he manipulated mine. People often ask me if I feel bad about destroying Richard's life so completely. The answer is simple. Richard destroyed his own life the moment he decided to steal from my dying mother. I just made sure everyone knew about it. My mother raised me to stand up for what's right, even when it's difficult. She taught me that people who take advantage of others' kindness and vulnerability deserve to face consequences for their actions. And most importantly, she taught me that sometimes the only way to honor someone's memory is to make sure their story is told honestly. The blog post is still online. People still share it occasionally, especially when they encounter situations involving elder abuse or inheritance manipulation. It's become a resource for other families dealing with similar situations, and I regularly receive messages from people who found the courage to speak up about their own experiences because of my mother's story. Richard may have thought he was stealing money, but what he actually stole was something much more precious. He stole my mother's ability to provide for her family the way she had always intended. He stole her final act of love and generosity. And for that, he deserved everything that happened to him. The internet never forgets, and neither do I. Every time someone Googles Richard's name, they find the truth about what kind of person he really is. That's his legacy now, and honestly, it's exactly what he deserves. As for me, I learned that sometimes the best revenge isn't legal action or formal justice. Sometimes the best revenge is simply making sure the truth gets told. In the age of social media and online communities, a person's reputation is their most valuable asset. When someone destroys that through their own actions, the consequences can be swift, devastating, and permanent. My mother always said that what goes around comes around. She was right, as usual. It just took a little help from the internet to make sure karma found its way to Richard's doorstep.